last met, there's been a dramatic new development in the Syria situation. The Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian plane that had flown into Turkish airspace, and this feels like a major escalation. Is this the beginning of an escalatory spiral that will spiral out of control? Bruce, what do you think?
Well, it definitely was a big event. I mean, after all, a NATO ally, Turkey, shooting down a Russian plane, and at the same time that we're trying to find ways that we might have common ground with Russia. I think the reaction on the Turkish side has been a little bit trying to damp it down. I think the reaction within NATO has been along the same lines. There have been mixed signals from Moscow. You know, sort of the $64 million question is what makes Putin tick, right? Is he absolutely looking for a fight in a very confrontational view about what Russia's interests are? Or is he beginning to see that you only flex your muscles towards a certain point and then it starts to backfire? And I tend to think that when you put it all together, the Russian economy is having trouble, the Ukraine is not going his way, that if there's a face-saving way, he may be willing to not keep provoking. I do think it's a manageable conflict. What about you?
Well, I think there are many ways this could go badly. Right? Yeah. There's the Russians responded with economic sanctions, which will put pressure on Turkey, but also they have moved advanced air defense systems into Syria to protect their planes. Those hold at risk NATO aircraft, including Turkey's planes. You could imagine a tit-for-tat response from Putin. And it's certainly the case that Turkey did this with deliberately. This was not an accident. Right. They knew what they were targeting. They said they had given ample warning, but they knew they were shooting down a Russian plane that they knew was not actually the vanguard of an invasion of Turkey. This was a pretty bold step from Erdogan, and I think it's clear why he did it. Russia was bombing the Turkish ally, the Turkmen, a rebel group in northern Syria, and I think probably Erdogan was also frustrated with Russian efforts to back Assad. Erdogan had committed sharply. But here's the challenge. It seems to me that you cannot see a way that the Syria situation will improve without Turkey and now Russia playing better than they've played thus far.
Totally agree.
And so the question for U.S. leadership is, our strategy depends on other people doing better, and how are we going to incentivize them to do better? What is the leverage that we'll have over Turkey, over Russia? President Obama has tried to appeal to their better geostrategic interests, but that hasn't worked thus far. I think it's going to take a bolder leadership, and this is going to be the challenge.
No, I agree with that, because there's not a single country, including our ally Turkey, in which we see, leaving Russia out of it even, the conflict the same way. Erdogan is totally focused on Assad, and he really doesn't want to see us supporting the Kurds. We find the Kurds, both the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds, to be the best fighting force that's available there on the ground, right? So we have mixed interests with Syria. We obviously have mixed interests with Russia. You know, even the countries that are part of the so-called coalition are like, as they say, paying their $25 for membership, as Peter Baker said in the Times today, and then standing back. So I do think this is where, we talked last week, and I think we both had a sense that this was a watershed between Paris, Beirut bombings, Ankara, and the Russian plane being bombed by at least an ISIS affiliate, that the president does need to step forward, put this coalition together. But it's not just simple as, let's confront the Russians. I'm convinced still that ultimately Putin can't possibly see Assad as in his long-term interest. I think he knows what he doesn't want. He doesn't want open regime change. It leads to chaos. There's an argument that says that's not a terrible conclusion to draw from Iraq and Libya. But Assad doesn't really give him stability there. And the Russians, if they're responsible for stability in Syria, that's very different than doing instability in Ukraine, right? It doesn't work very well.
And just the contrast with 4 years ago is really striking. 4 years ago, you probably would have said that there are two world leaders that President Obama has invested time in and has improved relations relative to where they were under President Bush. And that would have been Russia with the reset. They even gave it a label, the reset of relations with Russia. But President Obama also invested heavily in Turkey and in personal diplomacy with Erdogan. In both cases, there's been a sharp retreat since 4 years ago. And now you see President Obama with apparently limited leverage over either of them and limited ability to influence their behavior. And particularly with Erdogan, that's quite distressing because they're a treaty ally.
But I wouldn't put that on his balance sheet in the negative column. I mean, the Putin, the high point of reset was when Medvedev was still in power. We did the START agreement, and Putin comes back into power and has an agenda that was, very different than he even had before. There was a president, by the way, who said he peered into his eyes and saw his soul. So I can't remember who that president was, but you probably remember.
Well, we can look it up on Wikipedia and find it somewhere. Yeah.
And with Erdogan, I think there is the issue, and this is the challenge any American president faces. The good news is there are very few countries, leaving out non-state actors, who define their interests anymore as strictly anti or pro-United States. The good news is that the anti. The problem is we have divergent interests with the Saudis. We have them with Turkey. We have it with some of our Asian allies. But Japan, I think, is a mixed set of interests and stuff. And so the notion of how you influence Erdogan when he has his own agenda, his own domestic politics about moving towards this, more of an authoritarian nationalism, I think that's more of a problem than just saying, oh, if Obama had been firmer or tougher, then Erdogan would have complied. Countries really, India has said that, we'll work with the United States on issues that we agree with. We have our own national interest. That's our 21st century world. That's really tough for anybody in terms of leverage. The critiques of leverage get a little too, if we do A, then they'll do B, and I don't think it works that way.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that states have their own interests. We're seeing that tested, that proposition tested in Paris on a totally different topic, on climate change. The global community is there in force and trying to negotiate a treaty, or not a treaty, but an agreement that would involve substantial pain for many of the countries. And up until now, countries have been unable to pay the short-term price that their scientists tell them they need to pay in order to have a long-term benefit. I wonder if this isn't going to be one of those issues where President Obama has his greatest regret. He came into office committed to advancing the ball, and I think he had a plan to achieve a major policy success at the end of his first year in Copenhagen in December of 2009. But then, rather than doing the domestic legislation on cap and trade, which is what he felt he needed to get to Copenhagen, he pursued health care reform and the stimulus package as first steps. And his political advisors told him this would generate political momentum, and then he'd get the other thing.
Right.
He never recovered from that, and I think Paris would feel very different for him had he made different choices in 2009.
I think his first term he didn't do well on environmental issues. I think the second term he's made it a priority, and he's found different strategies for pursuing it, right? So we have a bilateral agreement that we reached with China, the two largest sources of emissions, to each set our national goals and make a commitment. The question of enforceability is still out there to try to reach them. That's changed what's happening in Paris from that, number one. Number two, here I'll get in my other political dig, there was once a senator who was calling our attention to this in the late 80s, 1990s. And when he ran for vice president of the United States in 1992, a certain President George H.W. Bush dismissed him as Senator Ozone, right? My old boss, Al Gore.
Right.
So my dig is over.
Yes.
But here's the good news. I think what we're seeing is the whole dynamics of the zero sum of environment and economy is really beginning to change. You're beginning to see from big investment funds in New York, not only the one that Bill Gates is now setting up, that you can have a win-win here, and the investment opportunities in renewables are beginning to take that away. And I think that's really, if you make those commitments, it starts to change things. I think we have the denialists out there who still say it's not a problem, which is absolutely crazy. But the worst news for me is that even if they reach the goals in Paris, supposedly we have to get to a 3.6 degree increase, and the good news will be get from 8 to 6. But that's still well short of where we need to be because we've wasted so many decades trying to pretend it's not a problem. So, I think Obama's made progress despite Congress's opposition and irrespective of what happens in Copenhagen, that he can take some credit for, but he hasn't fundamentally transformed things the way that people like Al Gore really wanted to.
Well, and you're mentioning of Al Gore, underscores that this is a problem that has bedeviled those who want to make a dramatic change in response to climate change from the beginning. So he negotiates the Kyoto Accords, but he can't persuade President Clinton, his boss, to submit it for ratification. And the reason is that the fundamental problem that the measures that the advocates have said we have to take in order to address this problem that will appear 30 years from now impose sharp pain and dislocation in the near term. And they also require changed behavior from the developing world, which is understandably demanding a payoff from the developed world in order to make these changes. You add it all up together, and the sense I get is that it's not solvable without real American leadership. And I just don't know whether the world looks at America as the leader it needs to be to address
I think we're
this.
trying to set the example there. And so there are three things I think that are interesting. One is China just released a report, the most self-critical report that any official Chinese think tank has ever released on the environment. Why? Because the economic costs of not paying attention in terms of public health and other and coastal areas is beginning to hit. So that's where the economics are changing. Secondly, in the United States, you have things like the insurance industry saying, whoa, we got all these properties on Miami Beach. Maybe we should think about this. Third, my little going local. So there's a little town in the Blue Ridge in Southwest Virginia called Floyd County. That's has a sort of a very liberal, sort of old hippie element and a conservative element. And they pride themselves when all the water flows out of the county. Natural gas company wanted to build a pipeline into the county. This was a few months ago. And they didn't want it coming in. And you got a left-right coalition that blocked the pipeline. And the company decided we've got these very conservative people who value the environment for their own reasons, and these more liberal people who value it for their reasons coming together, so we'll go somewhere else. So maybe we can reproduce. So you and I can go out and form these left-right coalitions on these issues as well as our others, right?
Well,
in our spare time, right?
That's an optimistic reading, and we'll see if Paris supports that.
All right. Cheers.
Thank you.